Good morning. Our reading today is from Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 1 through 2. Then the word of the Lord came to me. You must not marry and have sons or daughters in this place. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. You can be seated. So, very short, direct to the point. We're very excited today to welcome our guest speaker, Pieter Valk. He is, yes? He is a speaker and author about vocational singleness and discernment. He also is a co-founder of an intentional Christian community called the Nashville Family of Brothers, and he's a licensed professional counselor. And he comes to us, and he's got a big one, and he also comes to us from Equip, which is the organization that we invited Amber. She came and spoke to us in March at a parent seminar. And yesterday, he co-led a retreat for singles at all of our Trinity locations. And today, I'm really excited for him to explore today's Jeremiah passage through all of those lenses. So let's welcome Pieter.
Yeah, you shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place. This is a surprising, one of the more surprising moments in Jeremiah's prophetic ministry. God is commanding him explicitly not to marry, not to have kids, which is in striking contrast to the beginning of the biblical story in Genesis, where marriage and procreation are central to God's blessings. And it also anticipates a shift that we're going to see in the New Testament, where Jesus affirms celibacy for the sake of the kingdom as a faithful response to a broken world. But in this passage, at that moment in Judah's history, the nation is kind of spiraling in unrepentant sin. Judgment is coming, and the people have broken the covenant again and again, and God is sending Jeremiah, not just to warn them with words, but to embody this warning with his whole life. So in that context, God tells Jeremiah, do not build a family here. Do not plant roots. Do not pretend that things are okay. Your singleness is going to be a sign that the world is not as it should be. And this would have really shocked his community. In ancient Israel, marriage and procreation were cultural expectations, and they were covenant identity. To remain single and childless was to live as an outsider, and was to invite confusion and to invite shame. And yet, God asks Jeremiah, as a visible act of obedience and prophetic grief, to follow those words that we saw on the screen. Now, it's important to say, this was not a universal command, but it was meaningful. God chose to use a single, celibate Jeremiah as a vehicle for his message. And later, Jesus, our Savior, and the ultimate model of how Christians ought to live, he also chose to be celibate. And God might even be calling some of you to intentional singleness. But there's also many of us who would resist a calling to singleness for ourselves, or resist a calling to singleness for those we love. So that's what I want to explore today. I want to explore this reality of celibacy in the ancient Near East and today, God's intentions for intentional singleness, and the tension that I think many of us feel with the singleness and the barrenness that these verses in Jeremiah get at. Because I think you guys know this tension. Some of you guys feel this tension in your bones. You can relate to the elements in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and what that brings up. Some of you maybe are afraid to bring children into a broken world like ours, into political chaos, climate uncertainty, global instability, or just because diapers are too expensive, Some of you are maybe grieving. You hear the word family, and you think of divorce and infidelity and disappointment. Some of you are single and you love it. So this kind of anguish may feel kind of distant. But others of you are single and aching because your singleness is involuntary. You know, for you, this passage doesn't read like a metaphor. It kind of feels like your life, that you're called to a thing that is not good. You know what it's like to carry a story that others don't understand. You live with questions that don't have easy answers. You feel left out of a narrative that the church often assumes. And maybe you've asked, did God really intend for singleness to be good for anybody? You know, if so, why doesn't it feel good for me, for the people in my life who are walking that out, and what am I supposed to do now? For me, from an early age, I was taught that the best things in life were enjoyed through marriage, and that if I was a good Christian, I would get married. I would have a spouse. Like even at the age of 5, I understood this. My brother and cousins and I would play house, and we would assign roles. And you be the mommy, I'll be the daddy, you be the baby, and then we start to fill out the B team after that. And all that's left is your annoying cousin, so we decide that she is going to be the cat lady next door. And how does she react? She does not like it. she yells like, "That's not fair, I don't want to be that," and she throws a plastic toy at me. Because like we were taught and we believed that getting married and having kids was better, and remaining single without kids was a curse, that it was not good to be the cat lady next door, you know? Then when I was in middle school, I started noticing that people were attractive. I started feeling magnetically pulled towards some people. I started feeling that gravitational force towards some people. And maybe like some of you, I realized that I was drawn to both girls my age and other guys my age. Often more so to guys than girls, but ultimately I was drawn to both. And at the same time, I was and still am a Christian. And I really believe that Jesus has the best advice for how we enjoy community with people. So fast forward to college, in one of my longer seasons of singleness, I started fearing that I would never get married. It was probably some Friday night when my roommates were going on dates, and after an hour of clicking through about a half dozen Netflix shows trying to find something to drown my feelings, I gave up, and I do what all good Christians do, which is I went to the Bible to find a promise from God to soothe my fears and tell me what I wanted to hear. But I couldn't actually find a promise in the scriptures that God had marriage for me. Instead, I found some surprising and challenging and inspiring teachings about Christian singleness. That, Jeremiah and really all of the Old Testament, it kind of leaves singleness in this rough place, okay? That it's not desirable, that it's a source of social shame, that you're missing out on physical and financial security and a legacy. But then Jesus changed things. Jesus established a new kind of singleness that was a gift. Jesus valued this new vocation deeply. And the scriptures and the early church gave a blueprint for how to thrive in vocational singleness. And in the early church, singleness really was a gift. Like lived out. It was a good thing. And maybe that early church has a blueprint for thriving in singleness that could encourage us today, particularly if we don't feel like our singleness is a gift. So, what did Jesus have to say about singleness? Well, let's look at one of his most direct teachings in Matthew 19. I think Andy taught from the earlier verses in this chapter at some point in the recent past, so I won't go over all of it. He talked about kind of Christ's challenge to religious leaders and to his disciples to take godly marriage more seriously, to return to God's original intentions for marriage that, except for in rare cases, God's people should never divorce. And then everyone is surprised by that answer, even Christ's disciples. So the disciples joke back that if the grounds for divorce were that limited, if godly marriage really meant lifetime marriage, no matter what, most of the time, then they joke that it would be better to break God's commandment to marry and procreate and to never marry than to put up with this high standard that Jesus is talking about. You know, it would be better to intentionally choose to be single and risk social shame and marginalization that Jeremiah's prophetic celibacy capitalized on, right? It would be better to do that than take his standards seriously. And they were joking. But then Jesus does something that surprises everyone, as he often does in the scriptures, which is he responds by saying, and I'm going to paraphrase here, yeah, actually, not everyone will be able to live up to this high commitment of marriage. So only those of you who have been given the capacity to accept that high standard, that high teaching, should get married. And then there's others of you who should intentionally give up marriage and sex and biological children for a lifetime and use the time and energy that you would have spent on a spouse and kids to instead contribute to my big Jesus project of making the world right with all of your time and your energy. And then Jesus concludes, and this is actually quoting Jesus, the one who can accept this should accept it. This is a really big deal. You know, Jesus is telling a crowd of Jewish people who are commanded to marry and procreate, who thought singleness was a curse of loneliness. He was telling them that they should consider lifetime vocational singleness. That this is an equally valid, equally normal, equally valuable path for Jesus followers. So what exactly is this kind of singleness that Jesus calls some people to? And how do we figure out whether Jesus is personally calling each of us to that or something else? And how can anyone who is single live into Christ's calling, at least for a season, regardless of how long their singleness is? Well, in Matthew 19 and in 1 Corinthians 7 and other passages, Jesus and Paul encourage Christians to consider committing to what's called vocational singleness. And I'm going to define vocational singleness as a lifetime calling to abstinent singleness for the sake of kingdom work with undivided attention. So let me break down that definition a little bit. The first part, vocational singleness is a lifetime calling. It's a calling. Christians have historically understood the Bible to teach that God actually has a preference for whether each of us steps into vocational singleness or Christian marriage. That God wants us to ask him which gift he wants to give us. That he wants us to trust him. And even if he seems to be calling us to the one we don't prefer. And to give him time and space to show us why his preference is best for us. I've already noted how Jesus in Matthew 19 says that only those who have been called to Christian marriage will be willing to accept his teachings around Christian marriage. And then later in verse 12, Jesus says, only those who have been called to vocational singleness will be willing to accept what I'm talking about here when it comes to vocational singleness. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 7, Paul says that he wishes all were like him, that all were called to vocational singleness. But God has given each his own gift. That God will call some to vocational singleness and God will call some to Christian marriage. But back to our definition, it's not just a calling, it's a lifetime calling. God intends for this particular kind of singleness that he's talking about to be permanent. In Matthew 19, Jesus speaks about a call beyond the singleness that we're all born into and compares vocational singleness to the permanent state of being a eunuch. In Luke 18, verses 28 through 30, Jesus promises this kind of 100-fold blessing of family in this life for those who give up the prospect of marriage and children for the sake of the kingdom. So it seems a bit like cheating the system for someone to ask Jesus for that 100-fold blessing and then to also change their mind and get married, And in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul recognizes and praises committed singleness and teaches that it's better to keep a commitment to vocational singleness than to end that and to get married if one has committed to that. Plus, the people who first heard the teachings of Jesus and Paul, and the Christians that those apostles mentored, and their disciples unanimously taught and understood that Jesus and Paul were speaking about a permanent giving up of marriage and sex and kids in Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 7. So lifetime calling. Now, you've probably noticed that if this kind of vocational singleness is permanent, then that's different than the kind of singleness we're all born into, right? Like we're all born single, and by default called to abstinence as believers. But none of us are born into this kind of singleness that Jesus and Paul are talking about in Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 7. They're instead talking about a calling to leave maybe what we can call the common singleness that we're all born into, and to step into a intentional commitment to give up marriage and sex to instead focus on kingdom work with undivided attention. Now, to be clear, God absolutely blesses those in common singleness. I'm not trying to set up a hierarchy here, one singleness better than another singleness kind of thing. And God does intend for some people to continue in this common singleness for decades or maybe even for a lifetime, in this place of kind of not knowing which they're called to yet, you know? But I also know many in common singleness who find it difficult to commit to a particular spiritual family or a particular kingdom work because they feel like they have to be ready to reorganize their entire life around a future marriage. That waitingness keeps them from being able to invest in the present as much, you know? Some of them struggle with job dissatisfaction or kingdom work unfulfillment or loneliness or a sense of just waiting for life to start. Yet the vocational singleness that Jesus is casting a vision for here is something different, okay? So I made that contrast clear. Okay, so let's go back to our definition. Vocational singleness is a lifetime calling to abstinent singleness. It is a calling to give up marriage and sex and at least kind of bearing children, typically. And we see this in Matthew 19 and in Luke 18, 28 through 30 and in 1 Corinthians 7. Jesus and Paul consistently understood this to be talking about a singleness that involves giving up some of those things. But I want to be clear, that does not mean that vocational singleness is a call to loneliness for the sake of the gospel. You know, that's what I heard growing up, but I don't find that anywhere in the scriptures. You know, I believe that this kind of intentional singleness is still a call to human intimacy in the context of committed family, connection in the context of the body of Christ. And we're going to get back to that. Okay, so now that we know what this vocational singleness is, let's explore what living out this vocational singleness could look like. What's the point of this singleness? So back to our definition and finishing up our definition. Vocational singleness is a lifetime calling to abstinent singleness for the sake of kingdom work with undivided attention. Jesus uses this phrase, for the sake of the kingdom, in Matthew 19 and in Luke 18 to describe this. And in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul explains that vocational singleness is a call to kind of pass on the possibility of spouse and children and instead use your availability from not having to raise kids to instead do kingdom work that maybe parents would struggle to find the time and energy to do. And to do that with undivided attention, with single-minded focus. And to clarify here, kingdom work, when I use this phrase, I'm not just talking about full-time ministry. I'm defining this as kind of any work that promotes healing and flourishing in the world in ways that treats workers justly and use resources responsibly, ultimately to bring kind of wholeness to creation in a way that displays the gospel. That's kingdom work. And lots of us, our jobs are kingdom work. But so why is this for the sake of the kingdom? Why is this the point of vocational singleness? Well, there's a lot of Christians, Christian parents, who are faithfully doing the kingdom work of raising children to know the Lord and to serve him obediently. And that kingdom work is time-consuming. At least that's what I hear from all the parents that I know. It's important work, it's hard work, it's a time-consuming work. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and a bit of back-of-the-napkin math, the average parent spends the equivalent of 2 decades of 40-hour work weeks raising kids. The average parent spends the equivalent of 2 decades of 40-hour work weeks raising kids. It's a lot of hours. The parents in here are like, yep, feels like it. So between the ages of 25 and 65, those 4 decades, that means that nearly a third of parents' kingdom work capacity is dedicated to their important work of raising kids, and therefore unavailable for other kingdom work. I think that's why Jesus established vocational singleness. Jesus hoped for there to be this powerful minority of Christians who have 50% more time and energy than parents to heal our communities with undivided attention in certain ways. Okay? Not better than parents, but different. I think vocational singleness is also for the sake of the kingdom because it gives every Christian hope for the new heavens and new earth. Hope for where we're eventually going to spend eternity with Jesus, or at least it's supposed to. So in Luke 20, verses 34 through 36, Jesus teaches that none of us will need sex or marriage in the new heavens and new earth. So vocational singleness preaches the gospel in a way that marriage doesn't, by actually serving as this kind of physical sign and hope for how we are all going to live in the next life. And contemporaries of early Christians, they saw marriage, most importantly, as kind of this necessity for securing physical protection and wealth, financial stability, and a legacy through descendants. That's why, people in Jesus' time were really interested in marriage, those things. So, when vocational singles then were kind of fulfilling the promises in the scriptures to celibate people, by experiencing just as much family and belonging and honor as married people in the early church, they were providing Christians then with this kind of preview of where we would all spend eternity, where God would keep us safe, where God would provide everything we needed, where God would not forget us. In contrast, or it kind of standing up next to what they got out of marriage then. But I want to update that because today I think that people are interested in marriage and sex because they promise a way to find faithful love and a way to escape loneliness. That seems to me why people are really interested in marriage today. So what if Christians in every city in America knew of some kind of local, intentional Christian community where there were vocational singles living as a family and loving each other in healthy ways, and we're committed to each other long-term as a community without the need for sex or competing for each other's affections? I think that could uniquely testify to the fullness of God's love. By previewing a time when we don't have to compete, we don't have to be more attractive or be more intelligent or be more funny than other people in order to be loved and in order to belong in a family. So I think that also could give us some really neat hope if we live that out well. I think it's also why it's really important for us to discard the idea that Christian singleness is a call to loneliness for the sake of the gospel. Because I think if you end up single long term, it is essential that you find some way to do community. Both because it's necessary for giving Christians that hope for where we'll all spend eternity in Jesus' family without the need for sex or marriage, but also because I think you're going to need healthy intimacy in the context of long-term lived-in family in order to be faithful to vocational singleness and in order to do the kingdom work that you're called to do. I think God made all of us for intimacy in family, even those called to vocational singleness. And I'm not sure where this idea where we got this idea that singles for Jesus are supposed to live alone and meet all of their intimacy needs in private prayer, but that's not how early Christians lived it out. In the first few centuries of the church, there were tens of thousands of Christians walking out vocational singleness who were committed to that and living in intentional Christian communities. They were still active in their churches and active in their city life. They had normal jobs. They used their singleness to serve the hurting around them. They weren't isolated. They were deeply loved and deeply involved. And I think that's what vocational singleness could and should look like. And that's honestly what it's looked like for me. I'm super grateful that I'm a part of a intentional Christian community in Tennessee called the Nashville Family of Brothers. And we are still committed to a couple of different local churches that we go to. And we're still connected to families in our churches and people at work and people in our neighborhoods. And we've got normal jobs. And 4 of us live in a house together as a family. And we gather each morning for a quick time of prayer before we go to work. And we have 3 dinners together a week, and we go on vacations together. And we even alternate Thanksgivings and Christmases with our brotherhood and with our biological families. All while we're trying to figure out what kind of kingdom work God is calling us to do with our singleness. And as we're discerning whether or not we want to do community with each other long term. But that's just one way of doing intentional Christian community and in the context of vocational singleness. I know other people who live in less formal communities, people who choose to continue to live with parents or live with kind of a married sibling and their kids, or people who commit to a life to live with an unrelated couple in their church even, and do life together as kind of a unit. And for me, it's also been a journey to figure out what kind of kingdom work I'm called to. But today, I'm a proud godfather and blessed with the responsibility of helping his parents raise him and his siblings to be faithful Christian disciples. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I get to help people make sense of big questions of faith and family. I'm humbled that God has used me to help start a ministry that helps pastors and parents teach their churches and their kids about the kind of stuff we're talking about here today. I'm grateful that I got to be a part of building that intentional Christian community that I mentioned earlier, and building that with others to offer family to people who are lonely. All of that is made possible by my availability in vocational singleness. And every day there are reasons to thank God for his call on my life. And so that's what's one way vocational singleness can look like. So to get towards the end of this here, how do we know whether we're called to vocational singleness or to Christian marriage? Well, before we get to that question, my hunch is that some of you who maybe feel some resistance to the idea of discerning altogether and to this idea of vocational singleness. So I want to mention 3, I think, reasonable objections that people often share when I talk about this idea of discerning. Because I think our culture often assumes that whatever feels most natural or most desirable or most difficult to resist must be God's will for us. But I think that scriptures invite us to a different starting point. Not like what feels right to me, but instead, what does God want to do through my life? So some say, for example, but I want to marry and have kids. Doesn't that mean that I'm called to marriage? Doesn't the desire for those things mean that God put that desire in me specifically? Well, if that were true, then maybe only asexual people would be called to vocational singleness. But that's not what we see in the scriptures and in the church. And most of the celibate believers that I know had a real healthy desire for sex and marriage and kids before committing to celibacy and as they were walking out celibacy. So I don't think those desires disqualify them from singleness. And I don't really think they define God's call. I don't think that's how we discern God's call. Others might say, but singleness is too difficult. It's not normal. It's not natural. Marriage is natural. Celibacy is supernatural. Something like that. And as if difficulty means that something can't be good, right? But I think that Christian marriage and vocational singleness are actually equally unnatural in some ways. Like, I don't think any of us have what we need inherently to do either of those well out of the gate. Really, in light of the fall and the brokenness in this world, it's sex and polyamory that come most easily to many people, not faithful monogamy or faithful celibacy. So I think to do either of those well, we require a gift of grace from God to do that vocation well. So I think they're both really hard. Maybe others would point to 1 Corinthians 7:9, where it says kind of it's better to marry than to burn. And saying, well, hey, if I'm having a hard time with abstinence, that must mean God's calling me to marriage. Isn't that what that verse means? You know? But I think Paul was actually suggesting that marriage is not a cure for desire, but is that he was correcting believers who were claiming that they were celibate but not really trying very hard to be celibate, you know, if you study some of the context there in the church in Corinth. And his caution was, you know, don't commit to celibacy unless you have the gift to do it well, yeah. And Jesus said the same thing about marriage. Don't commit to marriage without the gift, the grace, the calling to sustain it. And I guess there's also another objection you could raise. You know, I mentioned earlier that I'm more attracted to guys than I am to girls, and I kind of downplayed that because I didn't want that to be a distraction. I didn't want you to think that what I had to say here wasn't relevant to you because some of our stories are different. I was afraid that if I talked too much about the fact that I'm gay and about how I'm convinced that God's best for every Christian is either vocational singleness or Christian marriage with someone of the opposite sex, including for LGBT plus people like me. I was afraid that if I talked too much about all of that, that you'd think that I only considered vocational singleness because of my sexuality and because of my convictions. And therefore, those of you who are straight don't really need to consider the same possibilities. That vocational singleness is only for gay people or something like that. So let me give you two reasons why I think all of us who are unmarried should discern. First, because I didn't default to singleness, I actually discerned myself. You know, while I'm not attracted to women enough to really call myself like bisexual, I did date women in college while I was out as gay. I wasn't hiding that, but I was in, long story short, a Christian fraternity that had date events, and I had to take people on date events, and we stumbled into dating relationships, basically. And I even fell in love, and I nearly got engaged, and we broke that off for reasons unrelated to my sexuality, but I knew that if God called me to Christian marriage, it could work. But through Scripture and through the Spirit, it became clear to me that I needed to ask God what He wanted for me, not just assume. And Jesus eventually called me to vocational singleness. So when I say that I discerned, I really mean it. I did. But second, I think that straight single Christians should still discern, because I think the gospel needs more laborers in vocational singleness. You know, Jesus didn't come just to save souls. He came to launch His kingdom, His new kingdom. And He has invited us to help restore a broken world. But to a lot of us, I think redemption feels like it's too slow. And not because God is absent, but because maybe there's too few available to do the work in a certain focused way. And I think that's why God instituted vocational singleness, so that some could give undivided attention to some of that kingdom work, you know? So I do think that every Christian, gay or straight, should ask, Jesus, are you calling me to vocational singleness, or are you calling me to Christian marriage? So how do we ask God that question? How do we discern that? How do we figure out which gift God wants to give us? If I had another hour, we could go all the way through all that stuff, but I'll keep it short. Briefly, I think there's 5 ingredients to robust discernment. First, we've got to learn how to generally kind of bring an intentional question before the Lord and seek God's preference. We've got to grow kind of our general spiritual muscles for discernment, because that's number 1. Number 2, I think we need to address any emotional or theological barriers to either vocational singleness or Christian marriage that we have. You know, bring those before the Lord, talk to a trusted mentor about those. Third, I think we can figure out what kingdom work we're called to and see whether that points us more towards vocational singleness or Christian marriage, or doesn't tell us much about our calling. Fourth, I think we can look at our past and present circumstances to see if God has been kind of nudging us toward a certain vocation, kind of leading us some breadcrumbs. And then fifth, I think we've got to patiently give ourselves time to discern while seeking the advice and the direction of friends and family and mentors and maybe a spiritual director. But to be clear, even if you start feeling like God may be calling you to vocational singleness, that doesn't mean you should go make some kind of lifetime commitments tomorrow. That's not what I'm suggesting. Make short commitments at first. Maybe make a 1-year commitment not to pursue marriage. And commit to using the time and the energy you would have used for that to instead serve those on the margins in your community. And then after a year of living out vocational singleness and discerning with those 5 ingredients I listed, check in with the Lord and check in with yourself and with those who are praying with you about whether you have enough clarity to step even deeper into vocational singleness. So what do you do now? If you're hopeful, I invite you to lean in. If you're uncertain, I invite you to stay curious. If you're hurting, I encourage you not to walk alone. And if you're called, I encourage you not to wait. So first, if you're a parent, here's what I want you to consider as we leave today. Have you already assumed that your child is called to marriage? What if God has something else in mind? I would invite you to study the scriptures, study Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 7 with your kids and ask together, what might God be calling you to? And encourage them to stay open to either of God's callings, whichever will most glorify God in their life. And pray not just for their future spouse, but also pray for their future calling. Pray that they would follow Jesus boldly wherever God leads them. Second, if you are already single and you are loving it, give thanks. And maybe ask God how you might use your season of freedom for kingdom work and how to support those around you who don't feel like their singleness is a gift. And then third, if you are single and hurting, I want you to hear clearly that you are not behind, you are not disqualified, you are not forgotten, that God sees your ache, that he understands your longing, and he has never once stopped calling you to a life of joy and of purpose and of intimacy. So what if you asked him to meet you there? What if you stopped waiting to be married to find your purpose and your people and your path? But what if in your singleness right now, however long it lasts, you saw it not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be stewarded? It might not feel like a gift yet, but I believe God can meet you in your loneliness and show you that he really is enough. And that he's already working to give you a family and to give you purpose and to give you a seat at the table. And remember, Jeremiah did not choose singleness. God called him. God called him to it as part of a bigger story. What if your singleness, chosen or unchosen, might be part of a bigger story too? What if a meaningful minority of Christians gave up marriage and sex and kids to focus their time and energy on bringing forth the kingdom? Imagine this mighty band focusing all of their attention to address wealth inequality and racial division and homelessness and mental illness and a lack of care for immigrants and refugees. Imagine how all of that would bring the gospel alive for those who are curious about Jesus and draw him to them or draw them to him. Maybe this kind of maybe not yet believers would see this small but vital group of Christians giving up some of our world's most coveted experiences to spend their lives instead healing the wounds of others. And then those who are curious would ask, why? And those of us who are walking out vocational singleness could joyfully respond, well, I guess I just really believe that Jesus is who he says he is. And if that's true, it changes everything. If that's true, what could be a better way to spend my life than giving it all for Jesus' plan to make the world better? Jeremiah's singleness was a sign to his people, not of bitterness, but of truth. And Jesus' singleness was a sign to the world, not of lack, but of love. What if your singleness, whether temporary or lifelong, could be a sign too? A living signpost pointing not to what's missing, but what is to come. Would you pray with me? Jesus, you are enough. Thank you for seeing us. Every longing, every joy, every fear. Thank you that we don't have to figure out our future alone. Would you meet us here today? For those of us who feel lonely, be our companion. For those of us who feel anxious, be our peace. For those of us who feel directionless, be our guide. Give us courage to ask hard questions. Give us faith to wait on your answers. And give us joy as we walk with you, trusting that whatever you call us to, you will make it beautiful. We want to follow you, Jesus, in marriage, in singleness, in everything.